Well, I'm embarrassed because I recorded this from the board at school and I somehow saved it as an AVI and then somehow loaded on a non-AVI drawing. So you get me, full picture. Make sure you got the barf bags available, things like that. But let's go and cover what we need to cover tonight. The Revolutionary War starts with the Declaration of Independence, and then the Continental Congress wrote the Articles of Confederation to provide unity for the separate states that loosely performed the new United States. The Articles allowed the state governments to retain their powers. That was a very important issue for them. And what was derived from the Articles simply was a new central government that really had severe limitations. The central government consisted only of a Congress in which each state was represented equally, which meant they all had one vote. There was no executive or judiciary branches. The central government could not levy taxes. That's a huge problem right there. They could only request money from the states, and if a state was broke, were they going to cough up any money to the feds? No. The central government could not regulate commerce between the states. The states taxed each other's goods and negotiated trade agreements with other countries, which meant that there was no uniform foreign policy or trade policy from the new United States. There was no law enforcing powers that were granted to Congress. There was no process for amending the Articles provided, and the states retained all the power, not specifically granted to Congress. Now, when the war was over, the immediate need for unity was past, and things began to spread and spin a little bit apart. The states quarreled over borders. The states quarreled over tariffs. The states quarreled over debt. And foreign countries saw the lack of a strong central government as one that could be exploited. And so that led many leaders to begin to push for a government strong enough to settle disputes, to regulate commerce, and to levy limited taxes. An important turning point occurred when farmers in western Massachusetts, in debt, unable to pay their taxes, and very unhappy politically, rebelled against foreclosures, forcing judges out of court and freeing debtors from jail. Shays' Rebellion, as this was called, was eventually controlled, but it encouraged leaders to seek stronger central government. And Shays' Rebellion was not the only rebellion that occurred in the time period. There was one in western Pennsylvania. There was also one among the Scots-Irish in North Carolina. Now, the Constitutional Convention, after a stumble that occurred after no one showed up no one really showed up to meet in Annapolis. 55 delegates arrived from 13 states in May of 1787 in Philadelphia. And these men were important. They were planters, they were bankers, they were businessmen, they were lawyers. And many were governors and or had been congressional representatives, and most had read works by Hobbes and Locke, and they were also very familiar with Rousseau and Montesquieu. The five most famous delegates were Alexander Hamilton, the leading proponent of a strong centralized government, George Washington, the chairman of the convention, and the most prestigious member, who was also a strong supporter of centralized government, James Madison, a young, well-read delegate from Virginia, who is usually credited with writing large parts of the Constitution, and also took detailed notes of the proceedings. And Benjamin Franklin, who at this point is 81 years old. He's a delegate from Pennsylvania. He had also attended the Continental Congress in 1776. Absent were Thomas Jefferson, serving as ambassador to France, and John Adams, who was ambassador to England. Other absent leaders were Patrick Henry, who refused to come because he smelled a rat, as he said, and Samuel Adams, who was not selected by Massachusetts to attend. The absence of Patrick Henry and Samuel Adams almost certainly tilted the balance of the convention toward order and freed the delegates from criticism as they created a stronger central government. Now, the agreements that came about and the compromises that came about are these. The founders' common belief in a balanced government led them to construct a government in which no single interest dominated. They were concerned with the excesses of democracy. Elbridge Gerry, the delegate from Massachusetts, demonstrated by Shays' Rebellion, and they agreed with Locke that government should protect property. Benjamin Franklin, a strong proponent of liberty and equality. Sorry, I got my dog next to me. She's listening to me making faces. Proposed that all white males have the right to vote, but most delegates believe that only property owners should have the franchise. In their view, ordinary people would either scheme to deprive property owners of their rights or become the tools of demagogues. In the end, the founders did not include specific voting requirements in the Constitution, leaving each state to decide voter qualifications for their own citizens. A major issue at the convention was the balance of power between the large states and the small. The large states favored a strong national government that they believed could dominate, and the small states wanted stronger state governments that they could avert they could avert domination by the central government. These different interests, it's apparent, or are apparent, in the first discussions of the representation in Congress. Most favored a bicameral legislature, which is two houses, similar to the organization of most state legislatures since colonial times. What had been different, of course, was the Congress under the Articles, which was unicameral, and of course every state had only one vote. Now, endearing in this situation was the idea that the large states felt unfairly treated by the Articles, but the small states did not want to fall victim to the powers, to the power of the large states and the domination of the large states. The delegates from Virginia opened the convention with their Virginia plan that called for strong central government. And although proposed by James Randolph, the plan was almost certainly the work of James Madison, who along with Alexander Hamilton reasoned that a suggestion as boldly different from the current government would not be accepted, but might at least inspire major revisions. So you go for as much as you can, knowing that you're going to have to give up some of what you're going for. Their plan succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. The delegates took the plan seriously and began the debate with the assumption that the central government would be strengthened greatly. The plan called for a bicameral legislature, the larger house with members elected by popular vote, and the smaller, more aristocratic house selected by the larger house from nominees from state legislatures. Representation in both houses was to be based on wealth or numbers, giving the large states a majority in the legislature. The Virginia plan also called for a national executive and a national judiciary, two things that were very much missing from the Articles. Delegates from the small states countered with the New Jersey plan, presented by William Patterson. Just as Madison and Hamilton had hoped, the counterplan did not argue with the need for a stronger central government, giving Congress the right to tax, regulate, and coerce states to do its bidding. The legislature would be unicameral, and each state would have the same vote. The delegates from the small states were determined that the new legislature would not be dominated by the large states, and the debate between large and small states deadlocked the convention. Finally, on July 5th, a committee was elected to devise a compromise. Excuse me, before that, and the committee that was selected came up with a compromise on July 5th. Now, the Great Compromise, also called the Connecticut Compromise, called for one house in which each state would have an equal vote, the Senate, and a second house, the House of Representatives, in which representation would be based on population. Unlike the Virginia plan, the Senate would not be chosen by the House of Representatives, but would be chosen by the state legislatures. The House of Representatives would be directly elected by the voters, whose eligibility to vote would be determined by the states. The compromise was accepted by a very slim margin, and the convention was able to successfully agree on other controversial issues. Now, the other compromise was over the North-South differences, not on the issue of slavery itself, but more regarding the counting of slaves for purposes of apportioning seats in the House. The South wanted to count slaves in order to increase its number of representatives, and the North resisted. The delegates were concerned about too much concentration of power in the legislature. Let me back that up for a second. I think I skipped a line here. The South wanted to count slaves in order to increase its number of representatives, and the North resisted. The delegates finally agreed on what's known as the 3/5 compromise, which allowed the southern states to count a slave as 3/5 of a person, thus boosting their numbers. And that allowed for a balance in the House between the North and the South, because remember, only the House is based on population. That also allowed the slaves to be counted as 3/5 for taxation purposes. So each, I guess, got 60% of what they wanted. Now, another debate concerned the election of the president. The initial decision was for the president to be selected by Congress, but the delegates were concerned about too much concentration in the hands of the legislature, and that was too much concentration of power in the legislature. But on the other hand, they feared direct election by the people, especially since the House of Representatives was to be popularly elected. The compromise was to leave the selection of the president to an electoral college, hence today's the Electoral College. People who were selected by each state legislature to formally cast ballots for the presidency. And so what happens, or what the decision was to let people vote for a slate of electors who would then vote for the president. So there would be this intervening institution called the Electoral College. I'm not going to get too much into it right now because we will have to delve into it in a much greater way later. All but 3 of the delegates signed the document on September 17th, 1787, with others who opposed it leaving before that. The drafting of the Constitution took about 3 months, but the document has lasted for more than 200 years, making it the longest lasting constitution in world history. Now, to wrap that up, the ratification process was interesting. It, in essence, got divided up between what were known as Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The Federalists left the convention and proceeded to organize in the states long before the Anti-Federalists could get their act together. The Anti-Federalists found out about this long after, 2 to 3 months in some cases. And that allowed the Federalists to gather their wits about them and present a case to the people. And they used this by writing the Federalist Papers. They were authored primarily by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, with some authored by John Jay, who was the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. And what they did was make an argument for their new Constitution. And basically, the arguments boiled, there are a number of arguments, your book lists them, but the 2 big ones was the lack of a Bill of Rights in the Constitution. Simply, the delegates had run out of time. And secondly, the opposition, opposing the power being taken from the states and being reconcentrated back in the federal government. So obviously this was opposed by Elbert Gerry, who was actually a delegate at the convention, Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, a number of others who decided that they could not support the new Constitution, and at the same time began to marshal their forces together. But once the promise was made that they would make that the Federalists would make an effort, first thing, to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists lost their major argument against ratification. So we're going to look at that in the next thing, and we're also going to take on a little bit of the Bill of Rights, and then in the sixth lecture we're going to look at how to change the Constitution. So that's it for now. We're at 15 minutes. I'm trying to make every one of these 15 to 20 minutes long, and we're done. So this is the end of lecture 4, and I will put up lecture 5 later tonight.